Yes, ma'am. Oh, you're just stretching. When are we doing the genetic engineering talks? That's what I thought. How are those going? Good? Okay. Um, Today, what I want to do is I want to kind of finish off history and economics, at least as it stands at the moment. And then I want to talk to you about your presentations. Um, because the first time that we did these presentations a couple of years ago, we actually started the presentations and students weren't really kind of getting the gist of how to go about it. And so we put them off and had them redo some things and came back and they were much better the second go around. So I want to share with you kind of some things that I think about when I see presentations that will maybe help you guys prepare for next week. So let's recap, and you guys can help me recap. So what I want to do is put on the board here a timeline of the 20th century, and you guys can help me fill in the timeline. So going back to 1897, what happened in 1897 that is of importance to us in this class? German dude. Yep, okay. So Fritz Haber, what did he do? Somebody else? Jordan, what did Haber do? Oh, sorry, Robbie. Gosh, darn it. I confused Jordan in my class for you, or in my office for you the other day. I just haven't learned names because I haven't seen faces. What did Haber do, Robbie?
Was he the one that was using ammonium nitrate?
Yeah, he's the guy who invented a way of creating ammonium nitrate out of air, basically. So we refer to this as industrial nitrogen fixation. Sorry, Robbie, I'm an idiot. Aiden, what's the next event that might have occurred in this timeline? Next major event. First major war that we think of as kind of being a global war, although it wasn't a global war. Do you remember the dates? 1918. Yep. World War One. How is this event tied to this event?
They developed, they started using
Okay, so Haber also worked with pesticides, and many of those pesticides that he worked with were repurposed during war as chemical warfare agents during World War One. This is really the first time in history of humans that chemical warfare had been waged. What else? Somebody else. What else was different about World War One as a result of Haber's activities? So nerve gas is what we were just talking about, but what's the deal with explosives? Ammonium nitrate is used for what else other than fertilizer for plants? Yeah, it's one of the components of gunpowder. And so you now had this substance that was relatively uncommon in the past. It was more common because you can literally just create it out of air. So Haber worked on industrial nitrogen fixation. He also worked on the development of pesticides and other chemical agents. Both of these were instrumental in expanding and prolonging World War I. After World War I, next big kind of event that I would think of is 1929. What happened in 1929? Stock market crashes. This sets in a decade of a global depression that ended in 1939. So this is the Great Depression. What ended the Great Depression? The beginning of World War II. Nothing better than a good war to get your economy going, because you have to produce a lot of things in order to fight a war. And so this marks the beginning of World War II that lasts until 1945. Let me put all the dates on top so we can be consistent. Let's fill in some of the details during all this. Between 1900 and 1929, what was happening with agricultural productivity? Okay, so it's increasing. Why is it increasing? A lot of technological advancements. You begin to see the first appearance of things like tractors on people's farms. You have industrially fixed nitrogen to add to your farm fields. The science regarding farming has improved. And so you see in America, you see an increase in agricultural productivity. At the same time that during the same time period, what's happening to exports of American agricultural goods to overseas? Yeah, so they're decreasing. So increases in productivity, decreases in exports. What does that do to supply? You're producing more goods, you have fewer places to sell them. Supply goes up, and as a result, price goes down. So even before we got to the Great Depression, it wasn't a great time during this time period to be a farmer. What else is going on? We haven't talked about this yet, but what else is going on during the 1920s in the United States? Big social upheaval led to a lot of crime. Prohibition. The temperance movement. Alcohol was outlawed. This spawned a lot of home distilleries, if you want to think of them that way. Farmers, when they have this excess corn crop, you can't sell it on the domestic market because the domestic market is flooded. You can't sell it in exports because European companies are importing fewer of your agricultural goods. And so you have to find some way to repurpose your corn. What was the first big repurposing of corn? What was the first big repurposing of corn during Prohibition? Yeah, grain alcohol, baby. Ferment that stuff and then distill off the alcohol, and you're basically left with ethanol. The same process that we use to get ethanol to put in our cars today that we mix with gasoline. And so during Prohibition, a lot of that agricultural surplus was actually siphoned off and put into alcohol production for the illicit trade in alcohol during Prohibition, which was one of the ways of dealing with this increase in productivity and a decrease in places to sell this stuff. So anyway, not a great time to be a farmer. The Great Depression hits. It's an even worse time to be a farmer because now money is tight and you are already existing on relatively narrow margins to begin with. Then what happens in the middle of the Great Depression? So 1929 occurs here, but from 1933 to 1938, essentially, what happens in the Midwest? The Dust Bowl, which then makes things even worse because the Dust Bowl occurs at the same time that Congress is instituting Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. A big focus of that act was to do what with agricultural productivity? Decrease agricultural productivity, decrease the supply, which would then increase price. Little did they know at the time that they passed that law that the next thing that was going to happen to American agriculture is that the bottom was going to fall out of it. And so in the years from 1933 to 1938, we actually experienced food shortages, extremely high food prices at a time when people were least capable of essentially affording that food. And so it just sucked to be a person who grew up in the Great Depression. There's a whole generation of people. My grandmother was a member of this generation who lived through the Great Depression. This would have been your great-grandparents probably. And these are people who were hoarders to a certain degree. They saved things. My grandmother had the coffee can that she put the grease leavings in after she cooked, and it built up with old bacon grease over time. And then she used that to cook out of as a way of cooking, because that's what you did back in the Depression. You saved everything because everything had a use, and you never know when you might not be able to get that thing. We don't walk around with that mindset anymore because we didn't live through the Great Depression. But for people in my grandmother's generation, this idea of being frugal and saving things and things like this was kind of ingrained in them because this was such a disruption financially. By the time the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938 came around, they were rethinking their goals of reducing production. They came up with a different way of moderating supply. What was that different way of moderating supply? Yeah, Jimson.
The government.
Yeah, so they could control supply during agriculturally productive years by basically pulling product off of the market and storing it, and then in agriculturally down years where productivity was low, they could release that grain onto the market, stabilize prices for the consumer. This had the effect of raising prices for farmers during years of overproduction and reducing prices of food for consumers during years of low production. And so rather than just focus strictly on reducing supply, it was now focused more on moderating and controlling supply. World War II arrives. That kind of gets the world, in a sense, out of this global depression. In the United States, how does the United States respond to the war in ways that apply ultimately to agriculture? So we had already been investing in industrial capacity during the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, things like that. But during World War II, what did we really have to do? Oh yeah, so men went off to war. So the war was fought mostly by men, not exclusively by men, but the majority. What else happened relative to U.S. capacities that would affect agriculture after World War II? Jameson.
All the guys could come back from World War II and education in agriculture.
So after the war, there was the GI Bill. We'll put this over here in the after war in the post-war period. So you have these highly educated now farmers out there learning modern agricultural techniques, learning how to put technology to use in agriculture. What else was going on during World War II that changed, altered American agriculture fundamentally after World War II? In World War II, what did we build a lot of? We built, well, weapons, but what else did we build? So we built guns, but we also built, so we built jeeps, we built tanks, we built planes, we built ships. So our manufacturing capacity went way up. So our ability to manufacture what came to be known as heavy machinery um, improved dramatically. We really ramped up our manufacturing capacity to build large machines, machines of war. After the war, what did those plants do? Some of them remained plants that churned out tanks and things like this, but a lot of that manufacturing capacity was repurposed for what? So cargo ships and cargo planes, but what else? You don't really need a lot of tanks unless you're actually in the army. Yeah, they've put a lot of this manufacturing capacity into producing large machines that were used for other things. Construction machines, farm equipment, tractors, combines. I'll show you some data on tractors and things like this in a little while. So the manufacturing capacity improved a lot during World War II, and also our capacity for creating ammonium nitrate also increased because all of these explosives were powered by gunpowder, essentially. And so we had this huge capacity for creating ammonium nitrate. After World War II, what was that capacity turned to? Repurposed for? Fertilizer. And so the post-war period led to a boom in agricultural productivity. This boom in agricultural productivity was directly driven by things that happened during the war and things that happened immediately as a response to the war in terms of educating American farmers who went off to war and came back to the farm. And before they went back to the farm, they went off to college, and in many cases, they entered agronomy and agriculture programs. This was the time period when you see the rise of the major agricultural schools. Places like Texas A&M come to mind. This increase in the capacity for heavy manufacturing, heavy equipment manufacturing that got repurposed after the war into making tractors, combines, things like this. And then the widespread availability of fertilizers when these munitions plants retooled themselves to become producers of fertilizers. All of these things contributed directly to a boom in agricultural productivity. So there is a document that when I changed over to my computer during the summer, I've not been able to locate again, but the name of the document is Census of Agriculture, Census of Population, Census of the United States. It's a USDA publication. And what it's looking at is it's kind of looking at the 20th century, once again, through the lens of agriculture, looking at demographic change, looking at technological change, looking at productivity change. And so there are a series in the History and Economics PowerPoints, there are a series of slides taken from that publication. And one of the things that you'll notice happening over time is that the rural and farm share of the population is decreasing a lot over the time span that people have been keeping track of it. About 60% of the population was considered rural. Almost 40% of the population was involved in farming, and that makes up most of the population at this point. close to 100% of the population back in 1900 was either considered rural or farm, and that has decreased drastically. Nowadays, if you go back to 1850s, you would have found similar levels of farm employment going all the way back to the 1850s. So go from a country where almost everyone is involved in farming in one way or another to today. Do you guys have any idea what the percentage of the American populace that makes its living in farming is? Less than 2%, and it continues to decline. How can so many people raise so much food for so many other people who are not directly involved in farming? Back during this time, you had a lot of small family farms, and so a lot of people were involved in farming because each farm was relatively small, and they produced for themselves and they produced for the community directly around them. What do we have now in terms of size of farms? Yeah, they're massive farms. They're farms that are, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 10,000 acres of corn and soybeans and things like this. And those acres are, to a large degree, farmed by a relatively few number of people. How can a single person, farm 2,000 acres of corn and soybeans? Yeah, development of technology. They have big tractors, big combines. A lot of the work of the farm that used to be done by hand or done by stock animals is now done by machines. The other reason is that it's much easier and efficient to raise monoculture crops than to raise a diversity of crops. And so if you're only raising corn or only raising soybeans, if you have a limited crop diversity, you buy the equipment that handles those crops well and you don't invest in anything else because that's all you do. And so you become very efficient. A single individual can raise a large amount of crop for a large population. And so you've seen this decline in the number of farmers because of the advent of technology that then made it possible for single farmers to farm really large farms. And so the farmers that were successful bought up the farms of their neighbors. They got bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And you see the population of the United States moving from a more rural population to a more urban population. And you see the proportion of the people in America that make their living actually through farming is going down over time. This is actually one of the things that is leading to political upheavals in the American body politic right now, is this shift from a rural population to a more urban population. And just turn on the news, and what you see on the news, you can relate back to this demographic shift in terms of where people live to a certain degree. It's not the only reason, but it's certainly one of the contributing reasons. So here you see non-metro farming communities, farming-dependent counties. So this is the U.S. map divided up by county, and it shows you non-metro farming-dependent and metropolitan areas. And you can basically see that the green areas, which is the non-metropolitan farming, have basically declined drastically. The only places where you see farming dominating communities is really just here in the Midwest and the upper Midwest of the United States. Farming communities in Texas are largely gone, except for in the Panhandle, and a lot of farming counties that were dominated by farming in the 1950s in the southeastern United States are gone. We talk about deforestation when people talk about climate change and things like this. As it turns out, the United States is actually growing back more forests than it's losing, and a big part of this is the decline of farming in the eastern United States. And as those farm fields are abandoned, succession goes on, and those lands slowly go back to becoming forests over time. So, demographic change. The number of farms they have declined. The average farm has increased over time. And this is an average, so keep in mind that there are still plenty of small-scale farms, but there are also lots of large-scale farms as well. So you see once again this flip in the nature of farming. Um, and as farms have become more specialized, the number of commodities that they produce has also gone down. So farms are now larger. They're generally monocultures. They deal in one or two crops and nothing more than that. So farms have become larger, they've become less diverse, and they've become worked by fewer and fewer people over time. And so this is just kind of the change that has happened. You can see the average number of commodities on a farm is close to one. The upside of all of this is that farming has been very productive since the 1940s. And so you see farm productivity in terms of the amount of crop being produced has gone up and up and up and up, with occasional blips due to drought and things like this. But it's this kind of ever march of progress towards becoming more and more productive. Also, U.S. exports after World War II have increased dramatically as well. And so this productivity became problematic, though, after World War II because the Depression era system for stabilizing prices and stabilizing supply using the ever-normal granary, that relies upon the government buying up surplus agricultural commodities during agriculturally productive years and storing that until there are bad years. What's the problem that this graph has for the federal government? There aren't many bad years. And so the federal government ends up spending more and more money storing more and more grain, more and more soybeans, more and more wheat, more and more corn. And there comes a point in history where it just starts to get pretty expensive. That point in history was the late 60s. So we talked about supply and demand, talked about the Dust Bowl, talked about all this stuff having to do with, here's a grain bin, a corn bin. These are corn cobs that you see here. And here's a sign that says that this corn bin is a part of the ever-normal granary system. We talked about change during World War II, manufacturing capacity, Cadillac engines going into tanks. So the automotive industry retooled itself for wartime production, and then after wartime production was over, they retooled themselves again, going back to producing things like automobiles, for example. So we mentioned the GI Bill, and once again, you can see that there was a decline in enrollment rates during World War II, but as soon as the servicemen got back from World War II, you see this huge jump in the enrollment rate and the graduation rate, and that just continued throughout the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. Once again, that contributes to productivity as well. We could look at specific corn, specific commodities. So for example, if we look at the corn harvested in terms of the area, the number of acres, you see that back during the 1800s, the agriculture was expanding drastically in terms of the number of acres that we planted. But then by the time you get to the 1900s, that begins to kind of level off, and it begins to taper throughout the Depression and into the 1940s and 50s, and then it starts to increase again into the 2000s. But we're not planting that many more acres now than we planted 50 years ago. But what has happened with corn productivity in terms of total corn crop is the yield has gone up hugely. So even though we're planting no more acres of corn, each of those acres of corn is much more productive than it used to be. And that's one of the reasons for this ever increasing agricultural productivity. Notice that there's this kind of productivity in terms of grain yield, in terms of bushels per acre, is relatively constant until this period during and shortly after World War II, where there's an increase in the slope of bushels per acre versus time. And then after World War II, that thing just kind of takes off. And we've been cooking with butane ever since. this is what led to the problem with the ever-normal granary. And so this is an editorial cartoon from back in the 1960s, where there's a farm plan, and the farm plan is basically that we build the ever-normal granary, and there's no way to contain all of this agricultural surplus. It's becoming difficult and costly for the federal government to sustain this particular program because American farmers are quite literally just too good at what they do. So in the chapter on corn, Michael Pullen mentions this guy and talks at some length about this guy named Earl Butz. Who was Earl Butz? Yeah. Secretary of Agriculture under who? Under Nixon. Year is 1973. Was it 2T or 1T? I think it's 2T. 2T or 1T? It is 1T. Why did I want to put 2 T's in there? Freudian slip, maybe. In the book, they refer to him as the sage of Purdue, agricultural economist of sorts. He looks at the ever-normal granary and says, this is just too expensive. We've got to do something. At the same time that he's looking at the ever-normal granary and seeing that it's just this big black money pit that the government is pouring money into, after decades of very little in terms of poor production years, mostly good production years, and he needs to find a way of kind of unloading this albatross around the Department of Agriculture's neck. And at the same time that he's thinking about the ever-normal granary and what to do about it, what happens in Russia? Our Cold War enemy during this time, 1973. We're involved in a Cold War with Russia, and something happens in Russia. What was it? They experienced a multi-year drought. So if you look in central Russia, they have the same kind of climate that we have in the center of our continent. They're at similar latitudes. They're at similar distances from the ocean. All of those things combine to create this band of grasslands in central Russia that are very similar to the bands of grasslands that you see in the Midwestern United States. And those are also a highly productive agricultural area in Russia. They grow many of the same crops that we do because the crops that we grow are all kind of adapted to the same sort of climate. And so they have, the Midwest in the United States is the breadbasket of the United States, while central Russian grasslands are also the breadbasket of Russia. In the late 60s, early 70s, they experienced a multi-year drought, and they were experiencing severe food shortages. And Earl Butz looked at our frosty relations with Russia, and Nixon was a president who was known for doing what with regard to communist powers? It's kind of unusual. I think of Nixon in a lot of different ways. I think of him as kind of a crusty, curmudgeonly old guy who was pretty conservative. But in spite of that, he had a very different approach to dealing with China and Russia than presidents who came before him. What did he do that kind of distinguished his presidency in terms of relations with other countries? Yeah, Aiden.
He interacted with them a lot more.
Yeah, he interacted with them a lot more. He made overtures to these major communist powers in an effort to kind of tamp down the intensity of the Cold War, this escalation of the number of nuclear warheads, the world teetering on the brink of nuclear war. He wanted to kind of reduce those tensions, and during his presidency, he made overtures towards China. And because he kind of had this outlook, when Earl Butz was looking at the ever-normal granary, looking at the situation in Russia, Earl Butz said, hey, we have an opportunity here. We have an opportunity to make inroads into better relations with Russia while also doing this thing that will be viewed as kind of a humanitarian sort of gesture, which will also get rid of all this grain we're storing. And so he made overtures to the Russian government to basically take all of the grain that was stored up in the ever-normal granary and sell it to Russia to basically replenish their diminishing food supply. And the Russians bought it. And we put it on ships and we shipped it to Russia. And that was the end of the ever-normal granary. Now that the ever normal granary was drained, there was no reason to continue sustaining it, and so Earl Butz worked on putting a new plan in place to stabilize prices for farmers and also ensure an adequate food supply, which was the goal of the ever normal granary. The ever normal granary had two goals: stabilize prices for farmers and consumers and ensure an adequate production of agricultural product. But because of decades of high levels of agricultural productivity, it became difficult to sustain that system. So he put in place a system in 1973 that is pretty much the system that we have to this day. Change is slow in agriculture. And this basically is the current subsidy system. Are you guys familiar with how agricultural subsidies work today? Jameson, you're nodding your head yes.
A little bit. My dad actually writes a lot of programs for this.
Oh, really?
System.
Oh, interesting.
So I've talked with him very, very little about it. But more or less getting paid by the government to grow certain crops, have certain species of animals.
Okay, so there are some programs that are kind of like conservation-oriented programs, in which actually you can get money from the government for doing farming in particular ways. That's one thing, but that's not how most farmers make their living. Most farmers make their living growing large fields of corn and soybeans and other of your large commodities: corn, soybean, wheat, rice, things like this. Because of the law of supply and demand, what's always the problem with high productivity years? There's not more demand for food, so you have more supply, and that excess supply causes what to happen to the price? The price goes down. Simple neoclassical economics. So what the government does is the government sets a floor price. So every 5 to 8 years, depending on how well the Congress is functioning at the time, and in the time that I've been teaching this class, it's been 5 years, and that's what's kind of mandated, but it's been as long as 8 years more recently because government is largely dysfunctional. But every 5 to 8 years, the Farm Bill comes up. It's basically the modern version of the Agricultural Adjustment Acts, and it basically sets farm policy and farm pricing for the next 5 years. And in this bill, what Congress does is they talk to their agricultural economists, and they basically decide what is the floor price, let's say, for a bushel of corn. And let's say that floor price is $1.75. So what happens is, if you're a farmer and you're raising corn, you get your crop at the end of the season, and you go to sell that crop at your local silo, the grain storage area, and that's pretty much who buys your grain. You sell it at some local facility that then stores it until it gets shipped off to some larger business that is going to take this corn and convert it into all the things that we use corn for. If you have a good agricultural year, you have a lot of corn to sell. Everybody in your area has a lot of corn to sell. There's a lot of supply. And as you go to sell your corn, the price begins to drop. As more and more people go to sell their corn, the price drops further and further and further. And what happens is that as the price of corn falls, the price eventually hits this floor price. If there's so much corn out on the market, there's such a high supply of corn that the market price falls below this floor price. Let's say that it falls to $1.50 per bushel. What you, the farmer, do is you sell that corn to your local grain buyer for $1.50. And then what the government does is it cuts you a check for 25 cents per bushel to make up the difference between what the floor price is and what the market price is. So this is the market price. And so even if there's tons of corn and the market price continues to fall, the government basically keeps track of how many bushels you're selling, what is the price at which you're selling that, and then you apply to the government for a reimbursement, a subsidy, to make up the difference between what the market price is and what the floor price is. And so this is how the subsidy market works at the moment, and this is how the federal government goes about ensuring that there's an adequate amount of food being supplied to American consumers, while at the same time not being saddled with storing all of this excess grain themselves. They just basically make these direct payments to farmers to make up the difference between the market price and the floor price. If it is a poor agricultural year, it means that there's not a lot of product out there. If there's not a lot of product out there, what happens to price? Price goes up. So now instead of the price this year being $1.50, which is what it was last year when we had a really good year, now the price of corn is $2.25 per bushel. The government in this case doesn't do anything because the price on the market is higher than the floor price, and so the subsidy systems don't kick in, and the government basically just doesn't do anything. They say to the farmer, you're getting a good enough price for your grain, and that's it. If you are a farmer and you want to make as much money as you can, how should you go about farming? Should you have a farm that is small, produces a little bit of corn, produces a little bit of soybeans, produces a little bit of green beans, produces some farm animals and things like this? Or should you have a 5,000 acre farm that creates millions of bushels of corn? You should have a huge farm that produces millions of bushels of corn, because regardless of how much corn you and your neighbors produce, and regardless of how low that production drives the price, the federal government is going to make up whatever the difference is between the floor price and the market price. The floor price essentially sets a guaranteed price for your crop. Now, would farmers like to make more money per bushel than that? Sure. But if there's a really high supply and the market price falls below that, they don't have to worry about that because they're guaranteed whatever the price is that's in the farm bill. And they review this every 5 years and they adjust those things. And they've been adjusting them downward over the last couple of decades. The floor price decreases every iteration of the farm bill, which farmers are not particularly happy about. So Earl Butt said to farmers when this came out that if you want to stay in farming, you should do what? This is in Poland's book, in the section on the Sage of Purdue. Yeah.
Go big or go home.
Go big or go home. Get big or get out is what he said. But basically, if you want to survive in agriculture, you need to get big or you just need to get out. Because the only way you're going to survive is by producing large numbers of bushels, because the nature of the subsidy program rewards those individuals that produce a large number of bushels. Want to make more money? Produce more bushels. Because even if the price falls, the government is going to make up that differential between the floor price and the market price. People started getting bigger farms. They started buying up the farms of their neighbors. They got rid of fences. Go down on Old 210, down in the river bottoms, and you'll see a bunch of corn and soybean fields, and they are planted right up to the roadside ditch, and there's not a fence in sight. They planted what came to be known as hedgerow to hedgerow to maximize as much productivity out of the acreage that you had control of. When I was in Indonesia in 2010, I was surprised to see that there were rice paddies in the medians between lanes on highways. Farmers were actually raising rice in the medians between one set of lanes of traffic and the other set of lanes of traffic. Traffic circles, there were rice paddies in those fields as well, in those areas. I guess farmers were leasing those public areas out to grow rice. But this idea that you just basically farm as much arable land as you could possibly farm, and you don't worry about what the consequences are for price, because price in this sense doesn't matter as much anymore. The law of supply and demand has kind of been thrown out the window because you have the government stepping in to stabilize price. What this has done is led to what Michael Pollan refers to. This is a subheading of this chapter. The plague of cheap corn. So starting in the 1970s, we all of a sudden have all of this productivity because farmers did exactly what Earl Butz said. They got big or they got out. We have these huge farms producing all of this corn, all of these soybeans, etc. And now we have this agricultural surplus. What happens to a commodity that is really cheap because it is super abundant? We mentioned this weeks ago. You might not remember this. It was mentioned kind of in passing. You guys remember me mentioning Say's law? Vaguely? Do you guys remember what Say's law is? Supply creates its own demand. So you now have all of this cheap corn, and food scientists look at that cheap corn and say, hey, we can get corn really cheap. What can we make out of it? So now we make plastics out of corn. We make ceramics out of corn. The glue that holds the paper on your drywall is made out of corn. We make ethanol that we mix in with our gasoline out of corn. We no longer flavor our soft drinks with cane sugar. We flavor them with high fructose corn syrup. Before 1973, every soda you bought in the store was flavored, sweetened with cane sugar. Now you have to go pretty much out of your way to get drinks that are sweetened with cane sugar. Almost all of them are sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. Bread. So two Christmases ago, I got a bread baking book. I like baking bread. Do you guys bake bread ever? There is nothing better than freshly baked bread coming out of the oven. So my wife got me this. It's called the Bread Maker's Apprentice. It's a big, fat, thick book, and it's all about making different kinds of breads. It's excellent if you ever want to get into bread making. That's the book to have. But throughout that whole book, sugar is not really an ingredient in most breads. You don't need sugar to make bread. You need flour, you need yeast, you need water. What makes different breads different is kind of the ratio of those things, how long you let them rise and things like this, how you bake them, whether you bake them in a regular oven or whether you bake them in an oven where there's a supply of steamed water coming onto the surface of the bread, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all the ways in which bread differs from one another. I haven't gone through there and looked thoroughly, but I haven't yet baked a recipe for bread in there that calls for any form of sugar. Cane sugar, high fructose corn syrup, nothing. Go to your local supermarket. Next time you're in the supermarket, go to the bread aisle, pick up loaves of bread, and look at the ingredient list. And I guarantee you, in almost all cases, you will find high fructose corn syrup in your bread. It's not necessary to the baking process, but it makes the bread taste sweeter. And we've talked about our penchant for sweet in the past, haven't we? We are kind of genetically programmed to like sweet things. If you sweeten up your bread a little bit, you're more likely to get people to eat more of that and buy more of that because of the way that it tastes. So we take high fructose corn syrup and we put it in a product that doesn't even require any sort of sweetening. Bread. Why? Well, because it makes you want to eat more bread because it's sweeter, and it's dirt cheap to get. Why is it dirt cheap to get? Well, because we produce so much corn. And high fructose corn syrup comes from corn. Why do we have so much corn? Well, because we have a subsidy system that encourages people to overproduce corn. You know what there's not a floor price for? Just guess what there's not a floor price for. Broccoli, green beans, kale, lettuce, strawberries, oranges. That fresh produce area that's right inside the door when you walk into the grocery store, All that stuff in there, that's the stuff that you're supposed to eat because it's good for you, not funded this way. Cornflakes, funded this way. Corn checks, funded this way. Soda pop, funded this way. Pop-Tarts, to a large degree, funded this way. Did you guys hear about the Pop-Tart controversy? Oh man, somebody sued Pop-Tarts, the company that makes Pop-Tarts, because their strawberry Pop-Tarts are not made from strawberries. There's some strawberry in there, but there's also a lot of pear and apple and other stuff in there as well. Fresh fruits and vegetables don't have this subsidy structure applied to them. They're governed by just kind of the law of supply and demand, which is why the produce section of the supermarket is the most expensive section of the supermarket, because you're not subsidizing those crops with a subsidy system that encourages people to grow a ton load of broccoli. And I like broccoli. It's one of my favorite vegetables. And it's always way more expensive than it should be. But this is how we got here. We got to expensive broccoli in the year 2021 because of Earl Butz in 1973, which was because of post-war agricultural productivity that is directly tied to what happened in the United States during World War II, which was directly tied to some degree to things that happened all the way back to 1897. History is a long story of things leading to other things. You've probably heard this history. I hope you've heard this history in other classes. What you've probably never heard is this history viewed through the lens of agriculture. This is a class about agriculture. It's relevant to you, or should be relevant to you, because this is how the food that you get gets funded. This is why the food plate that are the dietary recommendations of the U.S. Department of Agriculture don't match up at all to the subsidy structure that is also set by the Department of Agriculture. All these subsidies for corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, things like that, while when you look at the food, the dietary recommendations that are in the food plate or the food pyramid before it became a food plate, which says that you should get a lot of fruits and vegetables. This is how we got there, got to the point that we are here. It didn't happen by accident. It happened through a series of decisions made by people. In many cases, trying to make the best decision that they could at the time. Maybe at sometimes making decisions that were self-serving. This is how our history plays out. And this is where we find ourselves in the year 2021. Think about all the things in this cereal aisle that are relatively inexpensive to eat. It's all because those grains that go into making those cereals that are the cereal crops, those are all things that are funded by this kind of a subsidy structure. Tomatoes. I also love tomatoes. Not funded by this subsidy structure. All right. Any questions about all of this? You should be able to tell this story from beginning to end, which is why I put a timeline up on the board. If you can tell the story from beginning to end, you should be able to answer any question on the test pertaining to history and economics. Practice telling the story. Tell it to your friends. They're going to hate you. They're going to think you're weird. But it's a good way to study for the test. Nothing wrong with being a little weird. For your presentations next week, those chapters are a lot to wrap your head around, and I recognize that. Do your best to not read off of note cards, because that's just amazingly boring and you're going to put the rest of us to sleep. Do your best to spread the presentation across the members of your group. Do your best to use the visuals that are in the report itself. The report itself looks at data one of two ways. One way that it looks at data, and they talk about this in the report, actually. One way they do this is by performing what are known as natural experiments. It's weird that a couple of economists got the Nobel Prize for this, even though people in natural sciences had been doing this for decades before they did it in economics. But they got the Nobel Prize in economics for doing this with unemployment figures in unemployment in light of minimum wage hikes in New Jersey versus Pennsylvania back in the 1980s. A natural experiment is where just because people are different, people in one place do something different than they do in another place. So one of the ways that they evaluate the effect of genetically engineered foods in societies with health and things like this is they look at one natural experiment that has been done, which is that the United States does very little to regulate the entrance of genetically engineered foods into the food chain, and England has prohibited them. And so you can look at the US and England and look at things like the rates of cancer in those two places, and you can say, well, what were the rates of cancer before genetically engineered crops entered the food supply? What happened after they entered the food supply? And have rates of cancer in England and the US been altered at all? So by doing these natural sorts of experiments, comparing places that have genetically engineered foods in the food supply and places that don't. The other way that they evaluate data is what we sometimes refer to before-after sorts of experiments, where they will, for example, in the section about agronomy, they will look, for example, at the productivity gains on American farms before genetically engineered crops came onto the market and after genetically engineered crops came onto the market. And if they were already increasing, the question is, did the slope of this increase change? Did the slope go down? Did the slope flatten out? Did the slope stay the same? Or did the slope increase? And so what was happening in agriculture in terms of productivity before genetically engineered crops became part of the landscape versus after genetically engineered crops came onto the landscape. These are the two ways in which you can kind of assess what the effect of something is if it's something that takes place at a really large scale, at kind of a nationwide societal scale, because you can't do controlled experiments with things like this. You can't tell Clay County that you can have genetically engineered foods and then tell Cass County you have to eat genetically engineered foods. It just doesn't work that way. You can't do those kinds of clean experiments. And so these are the two ways in which the scientists who wrote this report kind of evaluated the data. And so as you're presenting the findings from these chapters, present them in this way. Was this a comparison of non-GMO countries to GMO countries, or was this a comparison of before GMOs and after GMOs, and then what were the findings as a result of that? Hopefully that's already come through to you as you've been reading this. But if it hasn't, this is a good way of kind of dividing pretty much everything that is in all of the chapters of the report fall into these categories of ways of looking at data. So use the figures in the report to make your points. So my advice would be to figure out what points is it that you want to cover from the chapter that you're working on, and then look for visuals that are in the report that basically illustrate that point for you. And so if the report makes a point about the fact that agricultural productivity didn't really change very much after the introduction of genetically engineered organisms into the food supply, then make that point and then provide a graphic that shows, well, this is the kind of data that they use to come to that conclusion. Make sure that all of your figures are big enough that people can see them, and any text that you put on slides, make sure that it's big enough that everybody can read it. You need to submit your presentation to me beforehand so that I can have it loaded on my computer and have it up on the screen when we're ready to start. My advice also would be to avoid a lot of text on slides. Try and do most of your communication through images with text highlighting specific things that you want to highlight about it, rather than like a whole paragraph on one slide and then a figure on the next slide or something like that. Students tend to default to a lot of text to communicate the things that they could just as easily talk about. And oftentimes when students do that, they end up talking about the thing and then they flip to the next slide and all the stuff that they just said is now written on the screen. They're like, oh yeah, I just said that, and then they move on to the next one. It's just awkward. Also, if everything that is coming out of your mouth is on this slide, you could have just walked in and put the slide on autoplay and we could just sit there and read it. And so I would rather hear from you talking about the stuff that you're reading. So, illustrate things with images, avoid text when you can, use text sparingly and smartly, make sure that everybody in your group is contributing to the presentation, and make sure that the presentation is addressing the points that are made in the chapters. And if you do all of those things, you should be fine. Questions? All right, Monday. I'm not preparing anything for Monday. So the first group that we will hear from is the agriculture group. The second group that we will hear from is the health effects group. The third one that we'll hear from is socioeconomic effects group. The job of those of us not presenting is to listen attentively, take good notes, and have good questions when that group is over and done with. This is a way that you can get hopefully good information and good access to chapters that you may have not spent as much time on, so that when you then go and read those chapters, you kind of have a preloading of the information in those chapters so that hopefully those chapters will be easier to comprehend. Yeah, Aiden.
And we have to write a paper.
Ultimately, you do have to write a paper on this. That'll be due right before Thanksgiving, and once we're done with the presentations, I'll talk to you more about the nature of the paper. Yep. It's basically a letter to your Aunt Susie. So, yeah, but I'll talk about that later. And it's a fairly rigidly structured paper. First paragraph should be explaining to Aunt Susie what genetically engineered organisms are. Second paragraph should talk about effects on agricultural productivity and things like this and the environment. The second paragraph should be about health effects. The third paragraph should be about socioeconomic effects. And then the last paragraph is kind of a summation of kind of what your advice to Aunt Susie would be, given that she has expressed at Thanksgiving dinner some reservations about eating the food at Thanksgiving dinner because she might think that it's full of genetically engineered organisms. And that's the paper. The paper is a letter to your frightened Aunt Susie or Uncle Ben. I said Uncle Ben because it's a rice brand, and now I feel terrible. All right, see you guys on Monday.